If you've come here to learn Pragg and Hikaru's new Blitz weapon with the right pieces, you have come to the right place. I'm GM Max Illingworth, and here I'm going to show you how Pragg and Hikaru have been playing the Tromposki with bishop to g5. The Tromposki basically has the idea of trading the bishop for the knight on f6 to double black's pawns. There's also an active developing move where I can often develop in a quite aggressive way, or even play kind of like a torre with e3 and the later knight f3. So bishop g5 is one of these moves is both quite flexible but also quite tricky. In fact, I remember that my past chess coach, GM Ian Rogers, actually used to play the Tromposki quite a lot. And I started to play it myself in 2008 with quite good results in weekend tournaments. Now, if we do break down the different options at Black's disposal, the one that's the most common at a high level, as I just take back a few of these arrows here, is the move d5 is the one you'll see most often at a high level. The move 94 historically used to be the main line, but you don't really see it as much nowadays. And you have some other moves like e6, c5, and g6, and these sorts of moves that also can be played. Those are the options that we will be that we'll be looking at in this training. And if you do enjoy it, do make sure to leave a like and also to think about subscribing to the channel. Actually, if you find a King's Indian very annoying to face, King's Indian being this this sort of thing as black. If you want to avoid these sorts of positions, which definitely were the most annoying ones for me personally around 2019 to 2020 or so, well, the Tromposki actually avoids them because when they play g6, you get this option to take on f6 and mess up their pawn structure. So it's not like a normal King's Indian anymore. And up to e3 bishop g7, actually Nakamura has been experimenting with a slightly different approach, where the normal approach is to just go c4 and actually go for this kind of setup, which actually does give you a small and fairly pleasant advantage as white. Because in a position like this, black just really suffers from the lack of flexibility in their structure, whereas we do have a pretty clear plan of going for the attack on the queen side and getting our bishop really coming to life. And also notice the black's bishop pair is really not so effective in such a close structure. Hikaru played it with h4 and kind of went for this sort of approach against Furusha, which is also possible. If you want to play more dynamically, it is one way to play it. But I think the old way of playing was c4 and the fianchetto, kind of the Catalan style. It's probably going to be more effective and going to give you the better results as such. So that's what I would recommend that you guys go for. With that being said, we can move on also to some other options. And, well, let's go with the move c5 next, because I've played systems like the London or knight f3 and trying to be a bit flexible. Then you might know these ideas of c5 and queen b6 have the potential to be quite annoying. However, both Nakamura and Pragg have pretty good results playing the move d5 as white. That is, if they play d6, you can either go c4 as happened in a couple of Nakamura games, or you can just go knight c3 and just sort of play in the center and just get a pretty healthy position in this way also. So your choice there might vary depending on whether you like to play like d5, c4, and queen's gambit, or whether you're happy to put the knight on c3 in front of the pawn. But the big question really is, what if they play a move like queen to b6? And it's a point where you might like to mention in the comments below how you would deal with the threat of queen takes b2 in the position. Then you can compare it to what we will see happen in this very cool game between Pragg against Nakamura. It's kind of funny when the two experts of the Tromposki end up playing against each other, like, which one is going to win. So if you want to play a move like bishop c4, that's actually not that bad of a move in this position. Just saying the queen's not so great on b6. But the really fun line is the Vaganian gambit with knight to c3. The idea being that after queen takes b2, bishop d2, we sacrifice a pawn, but we end up getting a really strong attack. Or in a lot of lines, we can go for an e5 break. Often we'll back it up with knight f3, rook b1, possibly bishop to b5. And that's just going to give white very good compensation for the pawn, where, okay, in a short YouTube overview, there isn't time to go too much deeper. But I've actually done a course where I do cover the Tromposki in quite a bit of detail. So I'll put the link down in the description in case you want to learn more about these positions and have a full d4 repertoire as whites. Because obviously in this position you also have to be ready for d5 and various other moves that they can also play, as well as obviously knight f6 that we're looking at here. But yeah, going back to the game between the two experts, between Pragg and Hikaru. Hikaru tried to just play normally and not take the pawn on b2, but that was probably objectively not the best choice, as we see that in this position, the queen just doesn't really do that much on b6 when the pawn is defended. If they do play queen a5, you can just play knight d2 and avoid any shenanigans with knight e4 down the down this diagonal. And in the game, it just felt like Black was really struggling to come up with some sort of counterplay, where Hikaru tried to play the move f5 and get something going in that way. But f5 is also weakening the king side quite a bit, and the rising position. Maybe at this point you could argue that some moves maybe could be more precise, but Pragg did a good job just to putting the pressure, like going h4. A few moves later, actually end up playing the move d4 as well, just really throwing everything at the black king, just opening up, creating all kinds of weaknesses. And yeah, White went on to win pretty convincingly actually from this point. So very, very nice game by Hikaru, by Pragnanandha, I should say, in the very recent St. Louis Blitz 2024 event. Which actually so happened I did a homework assignment for my private students actually based on a lot of the instructive games from this tournament. So again, example some of the benefits that my private students only get. Actually, to be fair, in September, I'm thinking of launching like a group program where you'll be able to access some of the benefits that currently only the private students get, but it's something I'll talk about more in a later video when I actually launch it as it were. Uh, but anyway, going back to some other moves that Black can play here. Let's take the move of e6 next. And if you followed my channel quite a bit, you might actually recall this, the video where I talked about how 13-year-old beat a 2600 gem in 14 moves, and that was with Black playing d6 and going for this like c6, knight d7, this sort of thing. So you might like to check that video if you want to see how that plays out. In case you haven't seen it, the general idea is you are going to go castles f4, knight f3, e5 is kind of your general plan in these sorts of positions. Um, and yeah, like for my private students, I'll probably end up returning to this time going a bit deeper in a more detailed or separate video. But for you guys, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the move of bishop to b4. Because that's a move I think that is probably a little bit trickier to deal with, and also the one that you might face a bit more often, where kind of a few ways that you can play it here as white. Where Nakamura had a game actually where he played the move of queen d2. That being said, after d5, I do think that if Black gets this kind of French structure, that Black is generally just doing very well in this sort of position, where you do kind of miss not having the dark square bishop to cover it. In fact, it turns out I actually had a game with this the Black pieces about 8 years ago against Domagoj Dragicevic. And in that game, I just went b6 and basically just shut down the position. And even in a close position, it turned out my bishop pair was actually very strong and I had gone to win this game. I do think that looking at it now, b6 probably isn't so precise. And yeah, I probably prefer the move castles that Martinez played against Hikaru. Or even a move like bishop d7, where you kind of keep flexible and sort of build up on the queen side. Maybe wait until white's maybe not just going for the pawn storm. And then maybe you get back in the a bit later. Okay, it's sort of looking at this a little bit more from white's point of view than black's point of view. But when you kind of understand what the opponent's trying to do, then it helps us to find a better response. And the move queen d3 is a tricky one that actually I like to play myself for the white pieces back in 2008, 2009, and it's quite interesting to see that even today the modern Indians quite like this approach. The idea being that after d5, I bet you can also long castle here, just kind of play it like a Rubinstein French if they take on e4. And also, the pawn on d5 is under attack, so it's not like you're, losing a pawn to queen f2. It would just be, be more of an exchange or, okay, after knight f3, they also have some problems with the queen getting trapped, so, castling actually would be a bit of a tricky move and maybe even an improvement on the way that, Hikaru played it in this game. But in the game, he played e5 and, went for this French type of position and, it does come in a better version because black doesn't have the option of moving the bishop out of the way to clear the way for c5 because of the queen being on e7 instead here. And after bishop takes c3, it was a game where Nakamura beat a much lower rate player and with black struggles against c5, white was just doing very well here. And, if black does play something like bishop a5, which is probably a better move in this position, then, you can always play f4 and, still leverage the fact that c5 is, going to run into a b4 fork, showing why the bishop is not so great on a5 here. Or you can play it the way Hikaru did with queen g3, and, this version is probably not so precise. Like, I think f4 is probably the better move, but yeah, he did manage to also win from this position despite the opening not going so great for him. But yeah, probably f4 is a move I'd recommend for you guys to play if you get this position on the board as such. Because you already got the win from like the bishop not being so well placed. So those are kind of my thoughts on the move with e6. That I like the approach of playing e4 and just grabbing the center. Not being afraid to give up the bishop there with bishop takes f6. If you do already have experience in the Torre attack, you can experiment with moves like knight d2 and try to transpose back into this opening, which is a more systematic approach. But I have a feeling that you'll probably enjoy the positions of e4 more because you do get more chances to attack in those instances. So continuing with the move knight e4, it's a move that used to be quite trendy. Was actually the main line sort of historically, but nowadays you don't see it as much just because after bishop f4 you kind of end up getting an improved version of a London because the extra move in 94 is, knight can sort of be attacked for moves like f3 or bishop d3 or knight to d2, as it were. And if black plays, let's say, c5 trying to counterattack, which is sort of the way they used to play it in the 1990s and the 2000s, well, after f3, if they do play knight f6, you can just take and you end up just getting this really nice position like e6, bishop d6. Or if they do play queen a5, they sort of end up in this kind of poor man's sort of Sicilian, where like the queen is really bad on c5 and just have this very easy English attack style setup, where you're up like free tempi or something. So black really should play to move queen a5 first, just provoking that c3 block for moving the knight. And now dc5 doesn't really make as much sense when you've got these pawns kind of in the way of your normal knight development. However, you can play this really nice move of d5 and just transition it into kind of good Benoni, where it's just sort of hard for black to really do anything with his lead development. In this game, Nakamura played e5 and went on to win, but I think it's much better just to play e takes d5. And then after d6, there's a few subs you can go for, like bringing the knight to c4 and going for the pawn storm is the creative approach of the computer. But I think from the human point of view, the easy way is just to play queen d7 and just sort of head for a slightly better endgame. Like the engine will tell you there are more precise ways to play, but this is kind of a good worst case option where you just sort of use your extra space and make the point of black's piece are a little bit passive in this Benoni. So you can definitely play something like this, and it's going to give you very much a true results position where only white can realistically play for a win in a position like this one, let's say. So and I can also try to come around this way also. But yeah, that's sort of why c5 isn't really seen so much these days, where if they do play knight e4, it's usually going to be connected with the move of d5. And it's kind of interesting to me to see that actually Pragg was playing this move of knight d2 a couple of times against Naroditsky. Because when I was looking at these positions about 15 years ago, I always felt that the knight d2, that the exchange of knights just wasn't that scary, that black could, just take back with the bishop and just have a very systematic and, solid position with no weaknesses. So I think I prefer the Nakamura approach here of just playing e3 and then bishop d3 and just kind of again having that London with an extra tempo. Because let's say if black does play a move like knight c6 here, trying to put pressure on our pawn, well, that opens the door for like takes and d5, which will transform the position. And we kind of force black to find some very precise moves here that if your opponent hasn't looked at this with the engine, they are not so likely to find. Like over the board, most people go knight b4, and you just get this very nice advantage where again black already has to find very precise moves here just to not have a losing position more or less out of the opening. So it's like that if you have a computer you can hold it as black, but if not, it's going to be pretty tough. Which is one reason why in this game between Nakamura and Martinez that to avoid this problem of the double pawns and this very systematic approach for white, Martinez played knight f6, but I think you can kind of see the problem here that we basically have a London system with the extra move of bishop d3, which gives white a few good choices. Like if you wanted to play knight f3 and h3 just to not let their bishop out, that would definitely be quite reasonable. But Hikaru's choice of going c3 is letting him play bishop g4, but still having that extra tempo to work with. Like this is also going to be a little bit better for white. And if you have some experience with the London or with openings like the exchange Caro-Kann, then you're likely to be very comfortable in a position like this one because you basically have that type of position on the board where like white's playing these positions is basically just to put the knight on e5 and just steadily build up an attack on black's king. Whilst white is neutralizing their minority attack. Like if they go b5, so you'll be able to shut it down with b4 and get your knight to c5 in some positions. So it turns out that their minority attack is actually not so effective without the support of the dark split bishop. And again, it's something that, this is quite an instructive game that actually I went through with one of my private students quite recently, and like it's a great example of how to create chances in the position. But okay, for the purpose of the opening, we can see that 94 bishop f4 is going to be just a little bit better for white, generally speaking. And this is why the main move you'll see at a high level these days, and probably also the move you'll face most often in your own games if you're facing prepared opponents, is going to be the move of d5 in this position. The good thing though is after d5 you do have a bit of a choice of how you might like to play this position. Just going to just reorder the variation just very quickly in the file I'll share with my private students after this recording. But yeah, after d5, the way I used to play it when I started to play Tromposky was just go bishop takes f6 and just sort of double the pawns and make their structure a bit less flexible. And then about a decade ago, I started to shift towards more like systematic approaches like e3, where you kind of sort of build up the solid pawn chain as such and keep flexible. And there also some quite dynamic approach with knight d2, which I think I've covered in my course and also on YouTube in the past. So there's a few different options, and just so the video is not too long, I'm just going to focus on the move of e3 in this instance, because there are a lot of ways in which black can play, but the thing is we have different options with either taking on f6 or playing c4 or just playing it kind of like a torre where we may be able to benefit from not having played the move knight f3 so quickly. For example, one fun idea that sometimes comes up if they play e6, for example, is that if you want to play in a way where you're not really need to learn much theory but can still play kind of creatively, it can be kind of interesting even to play some moves such as, maybe not absolutely the best moves for black, but a move like f4 is actually quite an interesting setup where you kind of go for this stone wall where your bishop is right outside the pawn chain. And okay, the computer will tell you that it's not really the objectively best way to play it, but if you want something a little bit original that can set some fresh problems to the opponent, then it's something that you may like to explore in your own time. That being said, the way that Pragg and Hikaru like to play it is a little bit different. Where the way Hikaru plays it, and this is actually a move or trick I used quite a bit myself about a decade ago, is to play the move c4, and basically the idea is that you move water black into the bishop g5 qgd, which, given that they started with knight f6, is probably not so likely to be their main repertoire. I mean, there's a few ways you can play it, like knight f3 would be pretty standard here. But Hikaru, played it this creative way in a recent game against Caruana and Tile Tuesday, going for the rook c1, and after black played knight bd7. If you are wanting to go into the theory of this, probably c5 is going to be the more critical move in the position, and what you might like to explore in your own time. But in the game after knight bd7, basically after cd5, we see that white has basically move ordered black into the exchange variation. It's not an ideal version because you have the rook on c1 rather than queen c2 or castles. But again, if you have some experience already in these positions, it's quite nice transition in that respect. And as I said before, if you're not so comfortable with this transition, like say if you're, playing d4 for the first time when you play Tromposky, or just don't have much experience in the Queen's Gambit in general, and then you can just play it like with knight f3 or knight d2 as Pragg did, and that's going to give you a pretty nice attacking sub. A sub of c3 castles, knight e5 f4 is pretty easy to to execute in practice for attacking chances. So yeah, that sort of shows what to do if black plays kind of routinely in this case. Um, Whoops, I just yeah, clicked the wrong thing there, but we are back to yeah where I want to be. Yeah, if they play moves such as c6 here, I mean there's a few ways you can play it, like bishop d3 and bishop g4, and knight e2 is it was one way to play where you just kind of kick away their bishop and keep the option whether you go for c4 or whether you play it like with knight c3. But either way, I think white does have a little bit of an edge, and in a game between Nakamura against Yu Yang Yi from earlier this year, he did go for this plan where he did it without the move knight e2, but it's going for this sort of setup, and okay, probably the win wasn't because of the opening, because black did get in the move of e5 somewhat quickly, which is kind of why I was suggesting like knight e2, so that you have a little bit more flexibility. Like if they go e5, it's maybe a little bit less effective now than when you played f3 already. For instance, you go like c4 and try to put some pressure on their center as such. It's one idea you may like to explore after this video concludes. Speaking of that, the final section here that we will dive into, and yeah, it's true. This one's probably a little bit of a longer video than some of the other ones I've done before, but I like to mix it up a bit and give you guys a bit of a feel for what it would be like for you if you were one of my private students, like the different material you'd be getting on top of the private lessons, and this one's definitely quite indicative of the nature in which I do my opening file training videos there in general. So after c5, I mean the move bishop f6 is the one that both Pragg and Nakamura were playing as white, just doubling the pawns. And normally black does take with the g pawn here, because if you take with the e pawn, you do get stuck with this potential isolated pawn on d5. I mean, the computer will tell you it's not that bad for black, but it's certainly a position that's kind of easier for white to play after knight c6. I did see Pragg did lose to MVL in this variation in the St. Louis Blitz 2024. I think Pragg's knight f4 is probably just not the most precise. Like black was able to get some good play with the bishop pair, and the threat of doubling the pawns is also kind of annoying here. So that sort of explains why I think a better move is just to play a3 and kind of dodge this whole bishop b4. Could also make it if they do take our knight develops here with a tempo. We can bring our bishop out, we castle, and with the bishop pair, black's definitely doing fine objectively. But he also does have these weak pawns that do give us pretty good scope to outplay the opponent. And I would say I think it is an easier position for white to play. So that's why you tend to see the move g takes f6 more often. There was actually a funny game in earlier this year by Pragg in Norway chess, where Pragg played this bishop b5 move, and you end up being ding after ding blundered, but ding was also just much better out of the early middle game, so I do think it's better just to play dc5 and ask like how he's going to regain the pawn. E6 is a move you'll probably see the most often, but if you are watching this looking for a system against the Tromposky, I can mention knight c6 as being a little bit of a tricky weapon, where white does have to be a little bit careful here, because if you give black time to take back that pawn and, just get a good game, then yeah, that's not really going to be ideal as such. So the way that Nakamura plays it, and the move that I would recommend for you guys, would be just to go a3. There were a couple of games there was a game that Nakamura played against NVL where like NVL played e5 and Hikaru played b4 and the game ended in a draw. But if you play to move knight c3 and hit their pawn, that's one way you can ask a few questions, theoretically speaking. Move e6 is probably what you'll see more often, to be fair, and after b4. This does lead to a bit of a sharp line after a5, where here we do have to be a little bit precise, where if you are going to play this at a high level, it's kind of important to remember this move of knight d2, where you do give back the pawn. But on the other hand, you also get quite nice piece play with knight b4, queen a4. You could play bishop b5 first as well, but in the game white went knight b3, and yeah, I mean it's a case where any opening you play as white, if the opponent plays correctly, then it's going to be equal, and this position is also equal, and the game Nakamura Tursa Hakian did end in a draw. At the same time, it's not just a dry equal position. You do have an imbalance with the bishop versus the knight. Both sides have these double pawns, and it's definitely a position where there's a lot of scope for the stronger player to win as such. So yeah, I think it's a reasonable worst case for our opening that we get a position like this, it's not like the game just ends in a draw as such. So if they do play the move e6, again, there's a few different ways that you can play it here as white. Probably the most normal one is just to play it the way Pragg did with the move of knight to f3. Hikaru was playing this a3 move order instead, which I think might be just a free move against knight c6 and e6 to save some time. I do think a3 doesn't make as much sense when you can't back it up with b4 to defend the pawn. So here I'm going to recommend Prague's approach of knight f3 instead, which I will make the main line in the study as well for the benefit of my students. It's kind of interesting actually to see that the move bishop c5 hasn't been played in the database, and maybe it's they just don't want to run into c4 and this kind of structure. But to be fair, I do think that an endgame like this, I got a game against like Michael Roy's, I think nearly a decade ago, where I got this sort of endgame as white, and he just kind of outplayed me with the bishop pair advantage. So it's something I think is a little bit annoying, and I probably would just go for the move bishop e2 and potentially transpose back into what was coming up in Prague's games. So the move order in Prague's games is they were going knight c6, which actually in this version does make c4 a little bit more appealing. I think there was a very nice Carlson Kramnik game where Carlson outplayed Kramnik from this kind of position. It's a game I've shown a lot of my private students actually in the past, but maybe one I'll cover like in an exclusive video for them later. But anyway, also we're riding over it now while it's fresh in my mind just to remind myself because I've been getting a lot of good ideas for content lately. But yeah, after Bishop E2, this is the way that Hikaru was playing it, and yeah, probably the way that Black should play, or the way that Pragg was playing it, I should say. So in this position, the way Black probably should respond is just to go for the move F5 as Naroditsky did in a bullet game, where in the end White went like knight D2 and just went for C4, and White did go on to win the game, but again maybe not completely because of the opening. You could also just start with a move like C4 here, and if Black doesn't play D4, I think you are going to get a little bit of an advantage. After D4, you have a couple of choices where either you can take on D4 and play this position with the knights battling against the bishops, and also Black's key safety for an interesting imbalance. Or you can be a bit more spicy and play like B4, and position is still equal, but again, you've got some dynamic chances based on the strength of your center, like Queen B3, Rook D1, and you get a position to play as such as white. Um, and if Black plays a move Bishop to E7 instead, which came up in the primer game in Blitz, this game kind of shows a good example of the C4 plan working well for white. It works pretty well when I can't just go D4 in response. And again, we don't want to trade the queens here because the trading queens does help Black amplify the bishop pair. Instead, we keep the queens on the board, and technically Queen C2 is probably a more precise move order, but Pragg played Queen A4 in the game against Keimer, and did go on to win from this position. Like just to show you a few more moves, just so you can see how the middle game plays out. Like again, this is not a perfect play per se. For example, Rook at FD1, and then E4 might be a more precise version, but still with this move at E4, you can see that White is definitely getting some quite real attacking chances against the Black King. And in again, Keimer didn't defend in the best way, and White did go on to win with a very nice attack. Actually, I will show you guys the full game after all. It will, round out the training video nicely. So at this point, Black does end up grabbing a pawn with FE4. But with the move knight G5, we are getting it back, and you might notice that we do have the idea of swinging the rook into the attack via G3. So even though the computer will tell you that Black is technically still fine here, from the practical point of view, it's just a lot easier to play white when you're attacking and have the safer king. If I was white, maybe I would have gone bishop c4, and maybe this is the way in which I would have sought to bring all my pieces into the attack. But in the game, bishop d3 was played, which does actually give Black a little bit of a chance to fight back. Now Black is basically doing fine, and objectively, I probably should just go knight e2 and just try to liquidate and equalize. But instead, I continue to go for the attack, and it's a position where the computer will tell you, "Well, just play f4 and you win." But in a practical game, it's a little bit trickier, and in the end, Black blundered with the move of b5, and White's next move kind of explains why the move F4 was needed, because now Rook G3 is actually just winning, where there's just no good defense to Rook G7. And the problem with trying to cover it with the Rook is that now the Bishop is still covering it, so White will just take, and yeah, it's basically just up the exchange for nothing, and still with a big attack with the Queen and Knight around the King. And yeah, in the end, after Rook E5, Queen C4, Queen G7 mate, this is how this Prague kind of game ended, and well, but that gives some inspiration of how you can play the Trompowsky with the white pieces. Well, we can see that there are a lot of different ideas we can play with d4 and bishop g5. And that, if black doesn't play the move d5, we do get some decent chance of an opening advantage. And even if they do play d5, we still have that flexibility where we can choose from a few different options and have relatively easy play, while still also getting some interesting attacking chance against the black king in a lot of the variations that we saw. So that's kind of what drew me to the Trompowsky. I think it's what, has drawn Pragg and Hikaru to the Trompowsky in 2024. It'll definitely be interesting to see more of their games in the opening to, see how they kind of outplay their opponents in these, rather original types of positions. So do let me know in the comments below, what was your favorite part of this training, and if you do have any requests for any future content, like things you want me to cover or maybe experiment with in terms of the delivery style, you're definitely interested about that as well. But yeah, congrats to you for making it to the end. I know most people don't make it to the end of a YouTube video they start, so you're one of the top ones in that respect. Yeah, I'll see you in the next training, and until then, take care.